In this episode, we journey from log to fire epoxy console desk. Let's go. The story begins with the salvage of this log that was in absolute terrible condition. This lady created a post stating that she needed help removing this dead tree from her property. I said, ma'am, don't threaten me with a good time. After she kindly agreed to let a stranger onto her property with a chainsaw, mind you, in Texas, I went straight to work. The climate here in El Paso, Texas is like experiencing another planet, arguably Dune or Tatooine. Between the dry climate and windstorms, once the trees die, they literally just fall over. My big concern with this tree was the collection of sediment and dulling the teeth on my chainsaw. Because the log was on the opposite side of town, any issues would have caused significant delays. Tip number 1, contingency plans. Chaos is a constant. I brought the DEWALT just in case the teeth met significant sediment, but fortunately this was not an issue. As I began to mill the trunk, it became quite evident that there was a massive deterioration in the pith. I was a little disappointed, but it was at this moment the consideration of an epoxy project was born. Let me reiterate, the climate here is debatably like living on the surface of the sun. Between that and the elevation, the moisture content within the wood here evaporates like that's its job. Not to mention the tree was quite withered in the first place, so moisture content concerns were on the opposite side of the spectrum. In other words, too dry, which leads me to tip number 2, the periodic wetting of withered slabs. This allowed us to maintain that ideal 6 to 9% moisture content condition. If this is your first visit to the channel, this is a start to finish family-friendly furniture channel with a new episode on the first of every month. I'll teach you what I know, have some laughs, and after action some errors. If you enjoy the content, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you're really feeling lippy, feel free to leave a comment. Most of all, thank you for the support. Woodworking and furniture design is like anything in life. The more you learn, the more you feel like you need to learn. It's one of those things that you realize there are no masters, there are only students from a certain perspective. I simply want to be a greater student by doing better. These slabs were riddled with cavities, and I figured this would be the perfect project to challenge myself to unfamiliar territories. The decision to torch the cavities was duly beneficial. Number 1, it really helped me clean up a lot of the deterioration, and 2, cosmetic, it is really captivating to the eye in unison with a clear epoxy. Ulterior motives at its finest is all. The driveway was a perfect place to execute this skill as there was no surrounding debris that could cause any safety issues. After letting these dry outside for a day, we take some measurements to determine how much effort it is going to take to get these to the desired thickness. In general, I mill these to 4 inches so that we dry a realistic amount of material. Then I prefer to plane to 3 inches to maintain that rich, unique look you can't typically get with lumber purchases. With this project, we will venture beyond those dimensions because I'm working with a limited amount of epoxy and walnut, which is ideal for a sleek, simple, and modern design. And I want the entire project from surface to the legs to be nearly the same thickness dimension. We will touch on this a little later. Now, with this router sled, it has its capabilities and limitations like any tool. So I made these custom rails to elevate the tool as much as necessary for those thicker planes, which can be removed as the dimensions decrease in the process. After some careful investigating, I'd come to find out these carbide inserts were chipped on the corners there, as you can see. These inserts for the planing bit I purchased had been through the ringer. After multiple slabs and plenty of metal surprises, they had endured quite enough. So we went ahead and replaced those for a cleaner result. This is not as challenging as it may look, as you can purchase these for around $18 for a pack of 10 online. I'll put the link in the comments below. Thus we begin the rather extensive planing process this episode. The first thing I tend to do is ensure that the bit is tight and secured. All those vibrations and friction met with the planing process can loosen things out of place, so check that bit first. Next, I will try to determine the height point of the slab. We set the router to the surface and slide around the slab to see where we make contact. I personally don't like to push my router beyond about 1/8 of an inch at a time, particularly with the diameter of the planing bit. If you stress the router too much, obviously you will cause some damage. Trust me, if you've seen my videos, I have done this before. It's all a learning process, as most of us are autodidacts anyways. Some of us simply learn the hard way, like this guy. Ideally, I recommend router sliding with the grain to preserve the surface as much as possible. Unfortunately, these bigger projects, you have to work with what you got. I don't like to lean over my projects too much and lose my center of gravity when I'm operating machinery. So in this case, I have to plane perpendicular to the grain. This usually causes greater divots in the planing process, which will require more sanding, which will then cause some slight variations in the continuity of the surface. But again, we all work with what we got. I am blueprinting a few designs to resolve this issue, but it will require some welding. In theory, this will allow some modifications like an arm you can push from side to side without leaning over the project or potentially a tool. But I can hardly finish my episodes on time, so it may just be another shelved idea from the Idea Fairy. Okay, so I don't think I have enough epoxy for 3+ inch thick slabs, and then obviously this large cavity right here. The large cavity on this one is on the back side, right down there. That is going to consume quite a bit. And not to mention, it's not even going to be visible. I could probably put some wood down there, but I'm just not feeling it. We're not going to have enough. What we're going to do is we're going to router sled these down to about 2¼ inches. We'll fill the epoxy with that. I think that'll be just enough. What we'll do with that remaining 1/4 inch is we'll use that surplus to shave about 1/8 of an inch off each side. Maybe even more, not that I want to, but the goal is to get to 2 inches. Not as thick as I'd like, but we're just working with the amount of epoxy that we have right now. That's what we're gonna do, so let's do it. So you may have caught on by now, I am planing a rather significant amount off these slabs. Oh man, this is gonna be a lot of work. I got a whole inch to go. Let's get started. Bottom line, this was not the most efficient way to do this, which we will discuss later. As I continue this rather daunting task, at this point I am really starting to consider other ways I can get things to move a little faster. Oh my gosh, alright, this is taking too long. What I think I'm going to do is use my powered hand planer to get this moving a little bit faster. Let's do that. There you have it. I was planing this thing like it was my day job. Ain't nobody got time for that. So ultimately, psychologically, I could no longer endure the router sled at this pace. At some point, you have to work smarter, not harder. All right, guys. So for the most part, we're down to about 2½ inches. We're down to about 2½ inches there. So at this point, I'm comfortable switching over to the router sled. I got to do the other slab first, but at this point, I'm comfortable switching over so that we can get a nice, even flat surface. Because the powered hand planer, it's a little bit harder to stay perfectly flat. There's a lot of room for inaccuracies, whereas the router sled, nice and flat. We'll do that other slab, and then we'll hit back to the router sled again and finish there. The planing process can create quite a mess in the garage. I regularly have this issue because my breakers in the garage can hardly tolerate the tools I have in there already. So the addition of running a shop vac simultaneously is laughable. As I stated last episode, my garage is often mistaken for a human hamster cage. The easiest way to clear out most of this dust, if you're in this situation like me, is with a leaf blower. These things are awesome. It requires minimal effort and is actually quite efficient. I recommend still wearing some hearing, eye, and respiratory protection as you kick up all that dust. Otherwise, it's a great solution to a low power problem. Now that we finally have these slabs power planed down to that sweet spot, we begin the finale to this planing execution. One thing I forgot to touch on was because we had already router sled the slab down on each side, at this point it's really only necessary to power plane one side of the slab. Cosmetically, we were looking at protecting the side with most of the charring, so power planing the underside becomes most logical. Once the power plane is complete, we simply migrate to the router sled to even out any inaccuracies from the power planer. This gives us that nice flat surface on both sides of the slab without the effort of flipping multiple times. One of the things I forgot to do, which you may have noticed, is secure the slabs in place. Initially, the slabs were heavy enough that gravity allowed them to remain in place even as they were planed. However, as a lot of that thickness dissipated over time, they became significantly lighter. As the router passes over the slab, particularly with the bit's diameter as large as it is, it can cause the slab to shift a bit. Make sure you have these in place. One of my biggest fears with this process is something jumping, whether it's the tool or the slab. So ensuring that everything is secure as much as possible and you're not pushing the tool too hard are all things to consider in the process. After an extensive effort, we finally get these slabs right where we want them at the expense of quite a bit of time and energy. It was at this point I made a rather large purchase for a new tool to make this process significantly more efficient in the future, which I will show you momentarily. This might sound a little crazy, but I'm a huge fan of live edge surfaces. This goes back to my argument, a personal preference really. There must be a balance between order and chaos, between the oracle and the engineer, the objective and subjective, peace and war. This is just a personal opinion, but I believe that marriage, that pursuit, creates some things that are truly incredible. But let's lay the poet to rest. Edgar Allan Poe some epoxy already. In all seriousness though, I really only like one live edge on my surfaces. It may appear like I was drawing random lines throughout my work, but actually what I was doing was attempting to square each of the two elements of the desktop while leaving that one remaining live edge so that each of the two slabs join together nice and flush. I like the desk to sort of hug the seating side of the surface, which will be our live edge side. I particularly like the posterior of the surface to be as flush as possible so that I can hug the walls nice and tight. It works more efficiently, feng shui I guess you could call it. Alternatively, if you don't place the desk against the wall, the symmetry facing a client, for example, is the look I'm searching for. It looks more square, official, and less flimsy. This sounds a bit out there, but I feel as though it assists in establishing that relationship between the desk occupant and the individual seated on the guest side, a sense of authority from a certain perspective. Hopefully a constructive authority, not like the examples in Horrible Bosses. Can't have my desk go to tyrants, come on now. Now we can run that posterior side of the console desk through the joiner to make it nice and flat. From there we can square it off with the miter saw. If you notice, this became an issue while attempting to fuse the two slabs together in one continuous piece. They don't quite match up at the center point. One might ask, why don't you just torch the center of the slabs again so that they visually couple up? The problem at this point is heat. We have already planed and squared beyond the point of return, so introducing any heat at this point would not be constructive because it would likely upset the slabs, causing some movement. Instead, what we'll do is chisel out some of that excess so that we can blend it in later with some touch-ups. The long forgotten biscuit joiner. I bought a DEWALT biscuit joiner around 2004, but like my 2001 Honda Accord pickup truck, it just won't die. Ideally, you want to use dowels or dominoes when you're joining two slabs together like this, but because this is beyond the limitations of my dowel jig and I don't have a domino joiner, we will be relying on the strength of these biscuits complemented with the strength of the glue and ultimately the strength of the epoxy running the length of the slabs. The cool thing about this tool is I feel like it's significantly easier to line up each of the surfaces with the biscuit joiner than it is with my dowel jig. There's a lot more wiggle room, whereas if the dowels don't match up, you will not be able to join your work together. Each has its pros and cons though. The pro of joining with dowels is you will have a nice snug support system in addition to the glue, whereas with the biscuit joiner, I can set those biscuits right on top of each other for extra support. So I'm sick. I bought a new tool. I had to. I couldn't do it anymore. I got myself a sawmill. I'm gonna give you a shot of what it looks like.
Talking? Can I talk to that?
You want to talk to the camera too? What do you want to say? the chainsaw struggles with some of the smaller logs out here. So the sawmill will make it a heck of a lot easier to mill some of the smaller logs I have. That'll give me more free wood, yay, at a huge cost. Oriented strand board, or OSB, otherwise known as plywood, is not the preferred method for building a frame for epoxy, but I'm on a budget and I'm working with what I got. I had some MDF, but I wanted to use a single board as leaks were one of my biggest concerns at this point. The mill shipped to our house fortunately came in a freight container made of plywood. I decided to seize the savings opportunity, and here we are. If you are relatively unfamiliar with plywood, it is relatively thin and flexible. In order to assemble this without losing my patience, we had to add some 2x4s to the underside for support, but also for assembling the frame with screws. I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty nervous about this epoxy pour, as this was my first pour ever. Ideally, it would have made more sense to start with a cutting board or something of that nature, but what can I say? I often recklessly learn the hard way. There were 5 major elements of the frame we had to dimension here at the bottom and each of the 4 sides. If you can see that elevated area there in the center of the screen, there's a small piece that chipped off that I had to glue back on. In order to pour the epoxy with this section face down, it is extremely important that I make this flush with the surface. Now, this will all make sense momentarily. At this point, I'm trying to rid the plywood of any dust collection so the tape can get a nice, strong grip. Once we are dust free, we start applying some Tyvek tape. After watching various epoxy pours, I have heard nothing but good things about this tape, so I had to give it a go. This tape runs about $13 at your local hardware store. We then repeat the vacuum and taping process for the remaining 4 elements. The biggest concern from what I've studied is that the epoxy grips onto whatever it is adjacent to, like glue. So if you don't have a mold release or tape like this, the project will stick to these frames, of which will turn into quite a mess. Although I may have overdone the tape at this point, I was still hoping I would not have any release issues. This is when we finally begin assembling the frame. The dimensions look good. We have a solid amount of tape in place. I felt confident in assembling at this point. This is where those 2x4s come into use because the plywood is simply too thin to screw into itself. We utilize the surplus of plywood on those walls to screw into those 2x4s. Once I saw that first wall go up, a lot of my anxiety started to dissipate at this point. Do y'all know what I'm talking about when you have to do something for the first time, you get a little anxious and procrastinate? That is exactly how I felt about assembling this system. But again, once that first wall went up, I was feeling a lot better about the challenge. Work smarter, not harder. Drill those screws into the walls prior to attempting to screw into the 2x4s to make it easier for yourself. Fortunately, the rest of the walls went in there quite nicely and without major issue. At this point, things were looking really good for the frame, so I get out some of that caulk and begin to prep the frame to hit those corners. Depending on which kind you purchase, this can dry relatively fast, so ensure you got it where you want it prior to moving on to another task. Caulking was pretty straightforward. The concern was to ensure the caulk was sealing up those corners as much as possible. After each pass of the caulk gun, I ran my finger over the application to ensure the caulk gets squeezed nice and tight into those gaps between the foundation and the walls. We make sure we run the gun over each of the 4 sides of the foundation as precisely as possible, as this will likely be the focal point of any major leaks. When you send in an application that you're not exactly qualified for, but your unwavering confidence in yourself submits the application anyways. Well, this is how I feel about these slabs and giving them the name book matched. Typically, book matched slabs are sequentially milled slabs coupled on the trunk axis. Thus, when you flip one slab and lay it next to its sibling like a book, it's book matched. In this case, I matched the slabs on the stump side. So I guess realistically, this makes them pen padded. Anyways, they didn't really match up exactly at the center, so I added a little paint as it was too late to torch these guys, as we discussed earlier. We begin the sealing phase with mixing our 2-to-1 epoxy. Because the slab was so extremely porous, my intent was to apply copious amounts of the epoxy. Once I felt like a significant amount had been applied, I felt it was safe to let dry. However, it was at this point a couple issues would originate, some sooner, some later. Problem number 1 presented itself immediately. In my pursuit of preserving as much epoxy as possible, I literally designed and built my frame to the millimeter dimensions of the project surface. Yep, you hear that crack? The caulk ripped right off the foundation corner there. So there were a couple of problems arising. Size, which is fixable, but time, I have a limited supply of that. I can saw off 1/2 inch of the length of the surface without much issue, but resealing that edge and waiting for it to dry, well, that's a problem I would simply have to endure. But as I thought through the mess, I figured it would be an acceptable and minimal risk. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little bit nervous. I'm about to do a reverse pour. I don't know the proper verbiage. Anyways, the slab is currently upside down because I don't think I have enough epoxy to fill up the total dimensions of the cavities. Essentially, I'm trying to get the most out of the slab, at least visually, cosmetically. The top side of the slab I want to keep the most. So if I run out of epoxy, all I have to do is shave this side. I know it looks like the top, but it's actually the bottom of the slab. Yeah, oh geez. All right, okay, let's just get this over with. In order to gain access to each side of the frame during the epoxy pour, we begin to set up our work area. I grabbed these 2 little side tables I made when I was trying to brush up on my rusty woodworking skills. The 2x4s underneath the frame settled nicely on the side tables. From here, we prepped the epoxy. Now I've heard there are epoxies out there that are 1-to-1, but the products I have are 2-to-1. So we repeat that ratio and mix with the drill again. There were a ton of bubbles under the surface within the mix, which I found a little bit concerning because I could only heat the ones on the surface. So this was something I was watching closely during the pour. Now this is definitely not the most efficient way to epoxy pour. Ideally you want to get a 5-gallon bucket or something like that so that you can mix the entirety of the epoxy so you can pour it all in one movement. Fortunately, this actually works out to my advantage, which I will discuss momentarily. I was nervously watching the bubbles to ensure they rose to the surface, which fortunately they were, slowly but surely. I had my heat gun on standby so that I could give them a quick hit after the epoxy pour was complete. When you are selecting your epoxy, take note there are different depth ratings for each product. I thought all of my epoxies were deep pour, but I was wrong. So when I was pouring the epoxy around 1 inch or so, I noticed it was smoking. This is because the rating was only for 1/4 inch, an enormous overlook on my part, but fortunately enough heat dissipated without issue. Okay, I may have severely underestimated the amount of epoxy I was going to need for this project. I underestimated, but you know what, I'm not even going to tell you how much. I was way off. That's all you need to know. I was off, okay? I was wrong. I'm willing to admit I was wrong. What am I doing? I'm supposed to deflect. Never accept blame for anything, okay? That's rule number 1 of woodworking. Never accept blame for anything. There was a miscalculation somewhere, but it wasn't my fault. Perhaps it was the calculator. You know, the calculator makes mistakes from time to time, but nobody blames the calculator, right? I'm willing to admit that the calculator makes mistakes sometimes, you know? It's a dark day. I was so impossibly wrong. Way off on this one. Not even remotely close. Significantly off. I can't even put a number on it, but it's definitely not this. Definitely need more than this. It's not close. Marine's not good at math. We're not supposed to do math. We can't do it because we just can't do math. That's the problem. I know, whispering. We don't do numbers. Who can I blame this on? There's nobody else here but me. Good news is we don't have any leak. Well, no major leak. We had to plug one, but I think we're gonna survive a dark day. But we're gonna need more epoxy. I'm not gonna tell you how much. I went ahead and ordered it. It should be here in a few days, 4 days. So I'm losing some more time there. Of course, what else is new? We're gonna figure it out. You know when you're so stressed out, you become completely unaware of your surroundings? Well, that is exactly what happened to me last month. I thought I was completely out of walnut, and in the midst of the project, I rediscovered that I had an 8-inch by 12-foot board just sitting there right next to the rest of my wood. No, not hidden, in plain sight. So after chuckling about my lack of spatial awareness, this became a much welcomed blunder, which will be utilized as the base of the project. One of the things I like doing before running my planks through the table saw is first running it through the joiner. I hate to ruin my next trilogy of videos, but I think I'm gonna work on a desk workbench for my garage to support and supplement these smaller tools to act as larger ones. There are too many elements of my shop that could benefit from a better system. My joiner is one of them. If you have the cash, obviously a full-size joiner is better, but I drive a 2001 Honda Accord for a reason, baby. I'm a cheap date. Plus, this joiner works just fine. It's only 15 years old anyways. We make our measurements and dimension the walnut with the intention of making the legs around 1.5 inches thick. In other words, gluing the walnut boards together to make some girthy, more prominent legs. Again, one of the themes of my work lately is matching the thickness of the legs to the thickness of the surface. I feel like the desk is more intentional, complete with this kept in mind. Initially, our goal thickness for the desk was 2 inches, so the depth of the legs would fall short by 1/2 inch. But I designed the width to match the 2 inches of the surface to partially resolve the issue. You ever watch some channels where they seemingly over lather up the planks and you're thinking to yourself, what is this guy doing? It's all going to squeeze out the sides. I came to realize that if I didn't do this, there tends to be small gaps between the two planks. So although I end up wasting some glue to spillage, I found this to be more effective. This grain is something really special. It's kind of like a light to dark gradient. I'll either display this on the front or the back. Either way, cosmetically, it's gonna look awesome. But I do want these on the same side. We'll figure that out, but either way, awesome. If you are gluing your legs together and for some reason, whether it's slippage or a change in measurements, or you're eyeballing your projects from time to time, you can always use the router to flush those edges with a flush trim bit. One thing you have to be careful of is make sure you have the correct edge towards the guide. Otherwise, well, you'll just be eating into your project and shaping exactly the wrong side. That first leg, I was routing off a bit more than I should have and jumping. In this case right here, you can see the leg jump a bit, likely because I was routing off a bit more than I should have. In this situation, it would have been better to remove some of the excess off with a bandsaw first. In this case, the leg jumped around a little bit and you can see it on the surface of that edge. This is obviously no good, so we have to head over to the joiner to correct the deficiency. I could talk about furniture and woodworking all day, I really could, but I'm sure at some point you all don't mind a little mix-up. I don't know if you all have been following along with pregnancy, but our baby girl finally arrived, and it's just one of those moments in life that changes you. So be prepared for another assistant to the regional manager, or I guess since that position is filled, I'll have to come up with another title for her. Nepotism at its finest. Either way, I'll build her a mini desk here soon enough, and we'll make it wild and entertaining, as I'm sure she will be. Now that we have our legs perfectly flush on one edge, we can run them through the planer. My intention with the planer is to have the length and width of each of the legs identical. That is one awesome thing about the planer. You can set the depth, run each of the legs through, and have the exact same result. So I perform this on the identical side of each of the 4 legs to ensure they are indeed dimensionally identical. Another reason this is so important to me is I like to route out my leg pockets on the underside surfaces of my desk, so each of the legs must be identical so I can see the same dimensions for each of them. One of the great features of DEWALT's flagship planer is the option to plane for dimensioning or for finishing. Dimensioning is for some relatively rough planes at fast conveyor speeds, meaning the planks are moving through the planer faster, which equates to less cuts per inch. In general, I will run the planks through at least twice to get in range of the dimension I'm looking for. When I'm in that ideal range, I will switch to finishing, which slows the movement of the plank, which equates to more cuts per inch, which ultimately leaves a nice clean surface. How many times can you say dimension in the same episode? If you counted 22 times, you would be correct. One of the things I consciously try to doing in my episodes is remaining original, while trying not to repeat the same verbiage too much to keep you all from falling asleep. But one could assume that is a constant with my monotone voice.
Go to sleep.
I'm struggling with using the rounding bit on these edges right here of the legs, or if I should just keep them straight right angles. Sometimes these just look so clean. I don't know if I even want to, smooth them out at all. Like I think with the legs like this, these two legs being the front, these two legs being the back, I don't know, I think it just looks kind of clean. Now the thing is, I think I would have to balance it out. Instead of using a live edge on a table with straight edges like this, I think everything just has to be perfectly orderly, no live edges. Somehow adapt that live edge that I have right now to something symmetrical, intentional, by design, so to speak. So I think I'm gonna take a risk with keeping these straight. I guess it's not a huge risk because I could always round the edges later. I don't know. Who knows these things? Who knows? I don't have the right answer. Anyways, yeah. Okay. I want to keep these legs sized exactly the same, but I need to work out some minor deficiencies on each of the 16 sides. So I'm going to work these out with my orbital sander and 120 grit sandpaper. We'll make sure we don't apply too much pressure because even though the surface of the sander is flat, it definitely does not mean that the outcome will be flat. If you happen to apply too much pressure in one area, usually by trying to work out a deeper divot, it will in turn cause some uneven sanding. So without applying too much pressure, we're trying to work out those minor deficiencies. So I just sanded it with 400 grit and man, it just looked amazing. I think it looks really good. I did the corners with 400 grit and everything. I like the way it looks. It still looks clean. It's crisp. It's straight. I think it's gonna work out really well. So I think we're gonna stick with the 400 grit instead of rounding those edges. I'm just feeling it. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like when you just feel it, you're just like, I gotta go with this. I'm just gonna go with the feeling. You know what I mean? It looks good. I think we're gonna stick with it. Yeah, I'm excited. I love 400 grit. It's one of those borderline grits that can remove some deficiencies, but ultimately it makes the wood extremely smooth to the touch and ready for finishing regardless of the methodology. Hey guys, you'll have to forgive my attire. I snuck out of bed so I could do this epoxy pour. Yeah, so excited. Fortunately, my deep pour epoxy came 2 days early. This was a huge relief as I'm trying to complete the project on time. This allowed me to resume efforts after completing the desk legs. From my studies, it seems common practice to allow 72 hours for epoxy to dry, which was about where we were at after the first pour. So we reset our workspace and prepare for the deep pour. I found an epoxy online that was extremely price efficient and contained some incredible bonuses inside. I purchased 2 orders of 1.5 gallon sets for $65.99, which came with the 2-to-1 mix, disposable gloves, a couple spreaders, and a mixing bit. Not sure if y'all can see them, but I saw quite a bit of bubbles as I did in the first pour, but the manufacturer advertised bubble-free casting, so I wasn't terribly worried. Because of the volume of the epoxy I was able to attain, I was able to fill each of those cavities as much as needed and then some. This brand of epoxy was awesome. Affordable, high quality, and great customer service. 5 out of 5 stars. I'll leave the link in the description below. This is one of those moments a lot of furniture designers fear, the removal of the project from the frame or mold. Admittedly, I was in the same boat myself, being this was my first swing at this, which was arguably a swing for the fences. There are countless things that will go wrong with your project, but this actually went really well. The Tyvek tape did its job, the epoxy dried nice and flat, and we were able to successfully transition the slab back to the planer. We made it to the final phase of planing. We ended up with a surface that was a little bit thinner than what I had expected, but fortunately we planned for error. The funny thing about accepting chaos as a constant is you start to think with the consideration of contingencies as simply part of the process. Also understanding that most plans do not survive the first few moments of execution, and being prepared to adapt, as the ability to adapt is ultimately what shapes a lot of success. The limitations of a one-car garage can be stifling from time to time. Ideally, a larger router would be more fitting for these larger slabs. I can't help but continue to ponder the idea of incorporating this addition into that next desk workbench trilogy. I'm thinking of a collapsible design so we can fit our car in the garage, but also on wheels to enable free movement, with a surface built for expanding my CNC while being adaptable with my router sled and other various tools. But you know me, overambition leads to increased self-imposed chaos. All right, baby cakes, we got problems. Okay, I got 99 problems and epoxy is one. There's some major cavities in here, not to mention some major air bubbles in here. I got some cleaning up to do, but what I'm thinking of doing is instead of highlighting the charred areas, because there's so many bubbles, what I'm thinking I'm gonna do, instead of making this transparent, we'll just make it kind of hazy. I think my best way to salvage this project is just to make it hazy instead of transparent like glass. That way it'll hide the bubbles. Due to my lack of experience with epoxy, I just have to swallow the loss, but I think I can still salvage the project. I'm not gonna be able to save every feature, but I think I can salvage the project. That's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna have to vacuum this down, fill in those areas, and just keep on pushing, baby. There we go. So to break down this panic, there were two major issues that had come to full fruition at this point. Number one, because I reverse poured, as I call it, I created air pockets due to the shape of the slab. I completely overlooked this consideration. Number two, I only sealed the slabs once, and clearly that was not enough as there were countless bubbles along the torched edges. Solution to problem number one is don't pour upside down, but also make sure you have enough epoxy so that you don't have to do that in the first place. Solution to problem number two includes sealing the slabs at least 2 times. I'm still in a phase where I'm CNCing my bases into my surfaces. I have failed to create the time to really think this through. Ultimately, my biggest concern with this method is that I think there is greater possibility to create an opportunity for the slab to make more micro movements with that extra exposure. On the other hand, I'm not sure what kind of brackets would work with a modern design such as this one, with the legs immediately projecting from the underside of the surface without any fascia. I need to think this through at a strategic level, but we'll have to make do this episode. The prelude to CNC involves an extensive amount of gathering measurements with our calipers, measuring our location in regard to our anchor point and also anticipating a slight offset of usually 3 to 5/100ths of an inch, otherwise the joint will be too tight. For instance, if the pocket and the dimensions of the leg are exactly the same, the joinery is usually too tight. This usually will require forceful hammering, causing damage to the leg, or can even split the surface. Anticipating an offset based on the hardness of the wood is relatively key to a successful CNC execution. Once all of our measurements have been taken, a dry run has been made digitally and mechanically, we are ready for execution. And so we begin CNCing the pockets for the legs of the right side of the desk. One thing I've learned about CNCing over the years is the catastrophes happen when you're not watching. Usually the dramatic errors you will notice immediately, virtually before any significant events. However, the small errors, small misalignments are the slow daggers that ruin the project because you are not there to catch it or stop it. Which leads us to this event where I happened to catch what seemed like strange sounds and some smoke in the midst of the sawdust. The downcut bit for some reason did not fare well with the already hard mulberry, hardened even more by the epoxy. I suspect the debris was being funneled towards the surface, creating hotter and hotter conditions. Ultimately transitioning to an upcut bit immediately resolved the issue, an interesting lesson learned. A step I had to execute out of order a few episodes ago for my son's desk was sanding the underside. Obviously not a lot of people will ever see the underside of a surface, but for the sake of pride of your own work, it becomes a must. This time I made sure to sand that underside before inserting the legs into the pockets. This way there is no unintentional contact with the legs causing cosmetic damage. At this point, I'm really lathering up the pocket and superior portion of the leg with glue to ensure we have complete coverage of the adhesive. However, we immediately begin the cleanup process with baby wipes so that the glue does not have time to cure. Because I slightly offset the pocket for the legs, there is room for error in creating those 90-degree angles, so we verify with our square each of the 4 legs are precisely at a right angle. So as I try to remain calm and try not to panic, as my time this month inevitably dwindles, I work some late hours in the garage, again out of uniform regs, to work through some of those epoxy issues, which mostly include those larger air cavities I created due to my very own negligence. We hit the exposed cavities prior to giving the complete surface an additional application. As we were able to cure a significant amount of issues, we were not able to solve them all. However, we must push forward. At this point, we precisely mark our cuts for the circular saw to create our final table dimensions. This mostly involves removal of a few millimeters of epoxy so that the exposure is a flush surface of both wood and epoxy. As we work through the various issues we come face to face with in this project, we eventually come to the point where we are going to have to make some serious cosmetic decisions, in this case with the surface of the desk. The live edge just was not working for this piece as the project unfolded. Ultimately, I began sizing up a unique design that would take full advantage of the shape of the slabs. I gotta make a tough decision, and I have got to make it fast. So this is the design I kind of came up with, this rounded kind of seating area, you know, so you're gonna slide your chair in here. Your chest is gonna be parallel to this region right here. This will also give you some arm space right here, like this, you know, so some extra arm space. You can see that instead of just kind of sitting more so like this with your elbow hanging off the desk here. This is a little more comfortable, but I mean, in reality, my intention with making this like this is so that you can put your laptop or computer here. But even then, if you're working in the corner like this, both of your elbows are hanging off the table anyways. Man, I like the functionality of it to a certain extent, but in all reality, it's not that functional. And not to mention, I just don't like the way it looks. Again, I'm debating between just making this flush straight all the way across, or leaving this and obviously sanding it down and making it nice and neat. I also got a major problem here. Completely forgot about. I'm gonna have to just slam all this together relatively quickly. I'm just gonna have to sand it out. I'm just out of time. I failed. Worth my time this month. So let me know in the comments, if you do feel like commenting, what would you have done? Would you have left these rounded edges like this? Because it's kind of unique, kind of cool. It kind of salvages the rest of the slabs, you know, so do we let the slabs talk, or do we just make this straight all the way across and make it a very, very shallow console desk? Let me know what you guys would have done. I got to make a decision here, like right now. Why do I do this to myself? I got to take one more look. Stand by, stand by. As absolutely desperate as I was to make this a desk, this piece had its own destiny. I had ultimately failed at my plans to make this a desk, and hence the console table was born. We made the decision. It was painful, but I honestly think I just can't ignore the cosmetics on this. I'm gonna have to do a straight edge right across. I hate to be boring, but I think it's just gonna be a better picture. Honestly, I think that's ultimately what it is. It's just gonna be a better picture. We're out of time this month, and we are already late. The executive decision is cut straight across. I gotta stand out some rough areas, but that's just what we have to do this month, so we just got to make it work. That's what we're gonna do. All right. You ever hear perfection is the enemy of profit? I feel like this was truly one of those moments. I had to let go. As I progressed through the stages of grief, I could not help but reflect on how I could have done this better. And these were two things I came up with. Number one, I should have epoxied the front of the desk, which is related to the acquirement of epoxy on hand. This would have created a surface plenty large enough to create a large, full-sized desk surface, giving us more room to work with design. Number two, the leg locations forced me to make the surface smaller and smaller so that the edges of the surface remain symmetrical on all sides relative to the legs. I had truly backed myself into a corner, or in this case, a console table. However, I am not willing to give up on her yet. However, efforts must remain at ease until next month, when I will build a stationary chair for the set and design a collapsible extension for the surface, thus properly designating it a console desk. Until then, let's work some magic.